No, right, we'll move on to the Three Waters Section 17A review. Item number 5. We've got Martin Matthews representing the External Governance Group joining the meeting by audio-visual link. Hello, Martin. Hello. Can you hear me?
Martin hasn't got audio shown.
Martin, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, good. Right. Well, I'm about to hand over to you to make the presentation. Is that right?
We'll begin.
I think council officers were going to
begin. Right. Sorry. Thank you.
Good morning. Helen Beaumont, Head of Three Waters, to introduce the Section 17A review and to remind councillors that, well, it's titled Section 17A review, which sounds terribly bureaucratic, this is all about ensuring the best value for ratepayers from the services that we deliver. And so what we have done is evaluate the cost effectiveness of the systems and options for delivering Three Waters services, for the governance and for the funding of those services. And while this began back in the middle of 2019, it has been considered in parallel with the government reform program, which we've just been talking about. So it has not been done in isolation. We have been considering what's been happening in parallel. And I'll hand over to Teresa, who led the review team. Thanks, cool. Teresa.
Thanks, Helen. Why we've completed this review. The trigger for a Section 17A, the trigger that we had was the major operations and maintenance contracts coming to the end of their term for all Three Waters. It's, as Helen has mentioned, an opportunity to understand the challenges facing Three Water service delivery and also identify in turn where changes in governance, funding and service delivery are able to address those challenges. As Helen again noted, it was done at a point where we already knew the writing on the wall around central government reform. We didn't know how quickly things were going to progress, but the way in which we put together the objectives for the review was to make sure that we would be in the best place in terms of our preparedness and our best structure to respond to the reform programme. So the objectives that were agreed by the Finance and Performance Committee of the whole for this review, the first one is very much along the straight lines of a Section 17A in the Local Government Act around evaluating cost effectiveness of the Three Waters and in recognition of our strategic framework and community outcomes. And the additional one was added in around the cost effectiveness to the Canterbury region and the options of it back to Christchurch City Council. The first objective was really within the boundaries of our council and has, in our opinion, been achieved. The second one is ongoing and has gained significant momentum now. The key challenges identified in the review, they've been noted a number of times during the prior discussion. The challenges, I know that there was mention of Havelock North, but the challenges that have been identified are very much along the same lines as what's been identified across the country. Absolutely, there are some differences, but really they're about the state and funding the risks to water. Undervaluing has led to underinvestment. Christchurch City does face the same challenges that have been identified at central government level. The third one looked more across the board around the regulatory reform, but also around the cultural expectations and longer term challenges around climate change that are going to just, without intervention, would just increase the impact of challenges 1 and 2 further. And this is where it gets slightly complicated. The options that we've put forward now, we had the original Section 17A review where there were 4 options, which was a status quo, a standalone business unit for drinking water and wastewater, a council-controlled organisation that would not own the assets, and a full asset-owning CCO. The original recommendation in June 2020 was to transition to a standalone business unit, but the pace of the reform programme that was outlined in July 2020, after this review was completed, meant that we have reviewed those recommendations in light of the time frame, and there's a a second option now to retain the status quo with the support mechanisms in place to support our council during the central government reform programme. So in terms of those two options, the advantages and disadvantages, won't read them all out, but in terms of retaining the status quo, the advantages here are all outlined in the section 17A around the control of council. I know that's been mentioned a few times during the discussion for the first, around the MOU. It also reduces the, it means we can focus on the central government reform programme without any other need around internal restructure. So it just increases the specific focus on the reform programme, but that's also around engaging with other authorities, with Ngāi Tahu and local runanga, and also around preparing our own council for change with a minimal impact to staff minimising immediate impact. The disadvantages is it doesn't actually it wasn't the recommendation out of the Section 17A review because it doesn't address the challenges. It doesn't even start to address the challenges outlined in the review. However, although we could see the writing on the wall of central government reform, we didn't know that we were going to have COVID-19 or that we were going to have central government shovel-ready funding. So some of the disadvantages that were there for status quo, they obviously didn't allow for us potentially having $40 million and more to support the, to start addressing some of the challenges that were raised in the review. So option 2, our original recommendation, kind of the opposite to the last one. So really this was the agreed preferred way forward out of the review, because it does enable some elements of the challenges to be addressed within council whilst also best preparing our council for the reform programme. The key elements were around a sort of a semi-autonomous management and more commercial focus by separating it out into its own unit, and it had the opportunity around delegated governance. The disadvantages are around really around the timeframes. Those advantages were all under the expectation that we would have at least a few years to realise those benefits. And there is a small amount of cost that's specific around the establishment unit and independent governance that would not be required for option 1. And I should note that there are people that are challenged by a standalone business unit just because it's an unusual organisational hierarchy. It has worked really well in other organisations, but it can cause confusion and transition challenges if not managed effectively. So the recommendation, as noted originally in June, and that's what our Three Waters, the Section 17A review documents note, we recommend as a standalone business unit, but updated as of today as to retain status quo, and continuing to support the Mayoral Forum and engagement with Ngāi Tahu and local runanga and the community. And what's really important is not just the status quo. An internal staff working group is absolutely vital. It enables some of the challenges that would have been addressed for a standalone business unit, but mainly around the preparedness for our council and involvement in the reform. So a little bit more on the internal staff working group. Helen has already outlined the need for a programme manager. That's really important that this is put through a formalised programme that links up all of the different elements around reform. We need to understand the true cost of drinking water and wastewater service delivery for ourselves as Christchurch, as part of this transition and, well, as part of the reform. We need to understand it for ourselves. And we need to understand the dependencies of the two waters with the rest of council operations. The second one is around advice to support council for the central government reform programme and our contribution to the Mayoral Forum. They're currently preparing an RFP to go to tender to support each of the Mayoral Forum councils for the multi-regional review, and then preparing our business case. we note at the bottom around preparing progress reports, so the way of providing updates would be through the Three Waters Infrastructure and Environment Committee, bi-monthly. Impact to the annual plan, I think Pauline mentioned it earlier. The actual contribution would need to be determined as part of the RFP process. We were originally anticipating around 100,000 for our contribution, although there is opportunity for further support from central government that hasn't yet been confirmed. So the next steps, again noting the programme management and the programme being set up. In addition to that, going back to the first slide, we need to finalise our procurement strategy for maintenance contracts for drinking water, wastewater and stormwater, and continue cross-council collaboration around the longer-term impacts that cross over between water and other key services of council. And now over to Martin Martin, and thank you for joining us, Martin, on behalf of our external governance group. They provided the external support and governance across the review, and also, as you're aware, included Andrew and Pauline. So Martin will provide an update. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to your deliberations this morning. I want to acknowledge that I've watched the live stream of your discussion on the last item, so I'm aware of the thinking and decision you've taken on the MOU. I think it's timely that we're considering this matter alongside that, so thank you. I want to acknowledge the initiative that was taken by the Council to conduct the Section 17A review and to undertake it with council officers, including an external governance group of which I was one member. I think from our perspective, the review was a worthwhile one, and I think the council officers have undertaken a very thorough job. The analysis, I think, set out in the reports you have, I provide a very helpful picture of the issues, the risks, and I think also the opportunities for better managing Three Waters in the city. And I think the report shows that doing nothing is not really an option in this domain. As Teresa's talked about, the primary recommendation from the review is the creation of a standalone business unit which would operate inside the council, but which would be very focused on better managing these functions. And I acknowledge that that recommendation was concluded before the government's reform package was announced. But we made that recommendation in the full knowledge that the sort of proposals we now have from them were both likely and imminent. Now, can I just clarify that the way I see the options set out in the 17A review is that they are like a continuum from the status quo through to organisational options with increasing levels of independence and separation from the council, ultimately to a CCO that would be independent and owned. We were aware that, of course, the government would be considering something which might have had a much wider catchment, the Upper South Island or a South Island water body. But I think the recommendation we made, nonetheless, to move to a standalone business unit, we thought was both a desirable and necessary initiative to support the improved management of both drinking and wastewater. So they're dealing with the two waters, addressing a question that was raised in the last item. We felt also that by moving to a standalone business unit as an initial step, this would better position the council to more easily transition along the continuum of options that I've referred to, if and when that was required. Now, the government's reform package means that that transition may now happen more quickly than it might have otherwise been the case. As Teresa's mentioned, the council officers are now recommending effectively the status quo with arrangements to support the Tranche 1 activity with the reform program. We believe, I think, the key consideration for council today is what will be the best initial step for you to be able to most effectively and efficiently manage the expected transition to a wider water organisation if that proposal proceeds after this tranche 1 activity. The External Governance Group, we remain of the view that creating a standalone business unit is still the right initial step for the Council to take. And this is because, firstly, it allows you to clearly identify the assets, the costs, and the other resources that would need to be separated from other council operations, and in a sense to commence that process of change from that understanding. Second, it'll demonstrate both to ratepayers and to the government the council's clear intent to improve the performance and management of these essential community functions. Third, it won't create significant financial burden for the council, but it will allow the smoother and quicker transition of those functions to a new entity if, at the end of tranche 1, it's decided to proceed with the sort of reform that's been proposed. Alternatively, if that reform does not proceed, at least the groundwork will have been done to be able to better capture the benefits we envisage from creating a standalone business unit. Now, we accept the timetable that the government's set out means that the full implementation of a standalone business unit would seem undesirable and unnecessary until at least those long-term organisational arrangements are settled at the end of tranche 1 and tranche 2. So it may not be necessary to implement everything we've recommended. For example, my view is it wouldn't make sense to establish an independent advisory board as part of this initial establishment phase of a business unit. So just to conclude, my view is, and that of the other external members, is that firstly, we've been very impressed by the work that council officers have done with the Section 17A review, and that we stand by our original recommendations. Of course, it's a matter for you to decide what is the most sensible way to now proceed, both to respond to what I think is the need for performance improvement in the management of the three waters, and to be better positioned to deal with whatever changes may now emerge from this next tranche of government reform. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you?
We have to leave it for questions.
You leave it for questions? All
Yes,
right.
thank you.
Okay, questions? Sarah?
Thank you for that. That was really interesting to hear from the external group there. Just wondering, given the time frames now, do you believe that, you've had a really good in-depth look at the organisation as it sits, do you believe that we've got both the time, the resources, the staffing to be able to cope with both the restructure, working out all of the costings and all of the work on the Waters Reform Program at the same time? Yeah, for Martin. Yeah.
I think that the things that would be required to establish a separate standalone business unit are all things that will ultimately need to be done in any event if at the end of tranche 1 some separation is required. The council will have to do all of that work at some point. I guess what we're saying is that by doing it now, you at least expedite that process and it will be easier and smoother, whatever direction is taken in a year's time.
Yeah. Now, I was just asking whether you thought that we had enough resources to do both that and the Three Waters reforms work that is now going to be much quicker and involve a whole pile of staff time and resources at the same time as delivering the tranche 1 projects as well.
Sure. I think council officers might be better placed to answer that question, but I am very mindful of the point that Dave made in relation to the last item, which is that the funding that's available through the MOU can be for both capital work and operations. So hopefully if there's a sort of financial constraint in some of this, the government assistance that comes through the signing of the MOU may alleviate some of that picture.
And I agree with Martin that a lot of the work is the same. So whether we set up a standalone business unit or whether we look at the arrangements for two waters that would come in the future, we still have to do the work to identify the assets, the costs and the resources. The bit that we save is the restructuring. So that is the only bit that we save, and that's probably a relatively small proportion of staff time in terms of the planning, although it's a larger proportion of the staff time in terms of the implementation as that restructuring process itself. But the staff recommendations do recommend a work program to identify the resources, the costs and the funding.
I don't know about others, and it's not really a question, it's just simply to complement the quality of the report. I mean, it's extraordinarily easy to read, and normally I find some technical reports more than challenging, perhaps. But the problem statements, and those who've heard me sort of comment on this before, is that often we don't state what the problem is before we try to start solving it. We just go straight to a solution. So to see these problem statements, the current state and funding of water infrastructure results in risk to water and water services, undervaluing of water and water services results in underinvestment in water services, and regulatory reform, community and cultural expectations and climate change requires significant changes to water and water services. So the other three problems sort of starkly highlighted. And I probably wouldn't have wanted to go down the track of a standalone business unit, but what I think you've pulled out is the identification for an internal staff working group, and that could involve some external assistance if required, I guess, but to develop these clear understandings of what all of the issues are, because that sets us up in good stead for resolving these problems regardless of what track we go down. So, congratulations to the writer. I'm presuming that they're in the room.
Thank you. It was a team effort.
It was definitely a team
and
effort.
we have a number in the room.
Okay, the team of writers, congratulations, well done. Yanni.
Thank you. On page 9, I really appreciate the statistics, and on the surface it looks quite like we are very much lower compared to the median investment. But I just wondered if you could, if it was able to break down those statistics in terms of per property connection from the city to the peninsula, and also whether you had any assessment of that money, what that was before the earthquake, and how much of the skirt repairs had kind of been captured in that. I just couldn't quite tell from those statistics.
So that is a very difficult thing to do. So to assess what the per property expenditure was prior to the earthquakes, and then to incorporate skirt, and then look at after the earthquakes, we have made some assessments of that, but they are approximations in terms of the funding per property.
Right.
I think it's more helpful.
Is the funding per property on a 10-year rolling average, or is it just an annual measure?
It's a biannual measure. So
Right.
Water New Zealand do a survey across the whole country, across community water supplies, or those who choose to engage in the survey, and it's done every 2 years.
Right. So is there like a chart that would show kind of historically?
Yes, and those can be found in the asset management plans for water supply, for wastewater and for stormwater.
Right.
So well, they are for total investment, but we can calculate per connected property as well. Separating it out into Banks Peninsula and Christchurch City would require a lot of additional work. We could do it. I'm not sure that it would be helpful in terms of what we need to do in the future.
Well, I guess, I think it was really interesting to see that government announced a bespoke package for Auckland and not for us when we had the earthquake issues with the skirt and the horizontal infrastructure governance group, which doesn't seem to be acknowledged. And we also had the forced amalgamation of the peninsula, which has added a huge cost around our infrastructure, particularly around the three waters. So I certainly, it was raised through this whole process. Can we get clarity around what the consequence of that forced amalgamation did for us in terms of our budgets and our delivery? Because, these statistics are quite alarming, but I don't get any sense of whether they're kind of skewed by the two big things that have happened to us.
I'm not quite sure how to respond to that as to whether or not we get a recommendation that you're asking staff to do that work. As I say, it's quite a lot of work, so I would need a formal recommendation before kicking that work off, as it were.
I guess at a high level, can you just give me some sense of why our investment in water is so much less compared to the median? Like, what's behind those statistics being so much lower?
So there's two possible answers to that. So in terms of water supply, there's two answers. One is economies of scale. So we are a large water authority, so we have economies of scale compared to many other.
As a general rule, we don't chlorinate
supplies.
river water, which is what Auckland does.
Well, yes. So, and the second one is the quality of our source water and the fact that it comes shooting out of the ground at pressure. So delivering that water to the consumer is also less expensive.
Yeah.
So that's a part of the reason for the operational costs being a little less, and also for our capital costs being less, because we're not investing in treatment plants for each of our supplies. We do, of course, have treatment plants on Banks Peninsula for the surface water supplies.
When I read 5.5 and it says, is outlined below, provides up to that information financial channels, historical underinvestment that has been exacerbated by the Canterbury earthquake sequence.
That's correct. So
Yes.
that's the general principle that
Somebody voted to spend all of the money for renewals on infrastructure repairs after the earthquake.
yes. So historically, like most water suppliers, we've invested less than possibly we should have, and there's a gap, and the regulations are asking for a lot more than they did in the past. So the standards for water supply infrastructure, as we all know, have increased. So there's a bit of an investment gap there.
Yeah.
And the earthquakes have also had an impact. So post-earthquakes, while some of our water mains are brand spanking and in excellent condition, there are others that have been patched and are more fragile than they would otherwise have been. Some of those are deteriorating quite quickly, yes.
Yeah. Okay. I guess one thing that I think would, because the information in here is really good,
Yeah.
but I think, sometimes context is really important as well. And I appreciate, I don't want to create a whole bunch more work for you to do, but just because we've got an integrated strategy around sort of, I guess, just communicating those higher level kind of expenditure on water, what we're doing, is there a kind of a dashboard type approach? And I think you did it really well for the coronation, when we were trying to do water conservation and the pump stations, and you had some really cool graphics, but I just wondered, in terms of a bit more holistic for Three Waters, just dashboard showing the community kind of what our targets are, how we're meeting those in terms of either expenditure targets or, I guess, key outcome targets. And just wonder if there's anything we can do in that regard.
Yes, we can, and most of that is captured in the draft activity plans and asset management plans for the long-term plan. And there we have the levels of service as well as some management performance indicators. Right. And we do propose, in fact, to put those on dashboards so that we can maintain
public facing.
Yeah.
Yes, some of those are public facing, some of them are internal, but yes, we will look to be able to communicate those more effectively and much more quickly than just an annual report, which is a snapshot, if you like, after the event.
Thank you. I think that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think also that if councillors can bear in mind these challenges as they have been identified in the Section 17A review, as they do the activity management plans, as we go through each one of them individually, I think people will be able to focus their attention on what it is that we should be measuring against in a far more productive way, and that is very much outward facing rather than inward facing.
Yes, and we have proposed some new levels of service around levels of investment that haven't been in the activity management plans before. So those, it would be good to get feedback from councillors as to whether or not they would find those helpful and to track those year on year.
Yeah. And I think that also from a public-facing point of view, I don't think that our current system of rating against property values actually indicates to people the true value of the cost of the supplying of water, and the general misbelief, the lack of belief that we don't own the water, that no one owns the water. I mean, I think that, it will require some courage, but I'd like to see the government resolve the issue of ownership, because that would then help us have a far greater ability to create a public understanding and awareness of the preciousness of this resource that we wash our cars with, and various other activities. So, very good. All right. Well, I'm happy to move the motion that we have in front of us. Do I have a seconder? Pauline? Any debate? I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. Thank you. And thank you, Martin. Please say thank you to the External Advisory Group for an excellent report. And I think, as you'll hear, it's going to continue to provide us with the basis for some good discussions as we go forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And can I thank you for recognising the amount of work that the staff did and the quality of the report. It was a huge undertaking, and I think it's really good that you did that.
Well, I think it's been also really helpful to have you and Andrew sitting on the Section 17A review, because I don't think we've had governance involvement at that level before. So
it was done differently last time. So when we did the previous Section 17A review, we did have some elected members in the creation of the doing the ILM and things like that, but not in the governance. So this was a different structure, and certainly from a staff perspective, we really appreciated it. We thought it added a lot. So thank you.
No, I think it made a difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you.